And we're moving into our second conversation for today.
We are having a discussion this morning with the Executive Director of the Friends of Conservation and Development, the FCD, and we have with us virtually Rafael Manzanero. Good morning, Mr. Manzanero.
Hi, good morning, Isani. Good morning, Marlene. Good morning, Belize.
We are looking at the issue of wildfires this time of year. And of course, we know that you manage one of the largest, if not the largest area of landmass in the country, which is the Chiquibul Forest. What are we looking at in terms of being able to deal with either sporadic cases of fires or fires that are deliberately set along the border areas?
Yeah, in the case of the Chiquibul Forest, we are looking at particularly two main areas in that zone, which is the Chiquibul National Park and the Caracol Archaeological Reserve. What you could see in terms of this season, mindful of the dryness and the lack of humidity, what we are seeing has been a whole set of forest fires in the two areas that we are very sure we can confirm and validate that all of those fires have been done by Guatemalans. That has been really a very serious one for this year. We have never really seen so much fires in that landscape. We normally have been documenting them on the Guatemalan side, but what we are seeing is pretty much then the whole set of fumes, smoke, fire, areas destroyed all along that western border.
So there's satellite imagery available. You were telling me that there's actually an update done on a daily basis. So the concentration of fires are specifically along the borderline.
Yeah, well, in the Chiquibul and Caracol, yes. If we fly further north, or if we see more further north, like in Vaca is another 17 kilometers of the western border. In the Vaca Forest Reserve, there is a mixture of fires there. The mixture meaning that there's a whole set that also started from Guatemala. It came into Belizean territory. There are farmers and, of course, ranchers right along that adjacency line, and so that is also another set of fires that were built in and created there. But in the case of Vaca, we also have communities, Benque Viejo, Arenal, and so we also can see that some of those fires were started either deliberately or carelessly by some of the farmers in that particular zone.
Yeah. Now, that's part of what I wanted to discuss. Forest fires, very often people feel it's just something that happens in the dry time, the sun sets dry leaves on fire and that sort of thing. But based on the data that is available, isn't it the case that the majority of forest fires are actually caused by humans?
Yes. In the mountain pine ridge, it's normally, and other areas, normally there have been also sort of natural fires. In other words, lightning would hit a tree, and that's how it started. But what we are seeing more and more in the areas and looking at all of those points, we are very clear, and communities know that these were done by people who were basically just starting to burn their milpas, or either by just a matter of carelessness. In other words, if you have a butt of a cigarette and you throw it out there, that thing is going to catch fire just automatically, and it just becomes a wildfire in a couple of minutes. Because of the dryness, there's a lot of debris under areas, a lot of leaves, and so anywhere, even in the villages, like in Sokots and Benque, all around the country, it's just so easy now to make a wildfire. I mean, these days, I mean, the temperatures are very high, so it just creates that environment. In the protected areas, I mean, you will consider then that along the western border, I mean, those were created by people who were either burning their pasture lands,
Yeah.
the pasture lands along the western border, or either for agricultural fields. And so the people are not really building any fire lines. People are not really looking at the temperatures. People are not really watching over their field, and so a lot of it is really more a whole set of carelessness in terms of those conditions that now we are seeing all around the country.
Yeah. Now raised the red flag last week that you were seeing. You said for the first time so many fires in the area that you're extremely concerned about whether or not it will reach an uncontrollable situation. Since you have raised the alarm about this issue, what's been the response, and what are your plans in terms of being able to try to control the fire situation?
Um, I am glad that the Forest Department, through the Ministry of the Environment, the Department of the Environment, Forestry Department, in the case of the Vaca area, there is a plan that was outlined, just 2 days ago. There are people now at that area. There is heavy machinery. The idea is now to contain those fires in the Vaca area with the purpose of ensuring that that fire doesn't really cross beyond and jump into the Chiquibul National Park. So a lot of the actions as from yesterday and today and the rest of this week is just to ensure that those fires in the Vaca are controlled and contained. The CEO, that's Dr. Percival, informed that it's pretty much contained in the Vaca at this moment. We are heading up there shortly. The Forestry Department is already up there, and the idea is basically just to monitor those fires, that they are basically contained in that, and that it doesn't really spiral more south. If it spirals down south, then we would have another set of fires coming from the northern part into the Chiquibul Forest. So that's the plan for this particular zone.
Yeah.
What we would intend to do, because frankly, I mean, we don't really have the equipment at FCD, we don't have the manpower, we don't have even the expertise really to be able to deal with forest fires.
Yeah.
Because forest fires is quite a new element, for us, because we had been observing them, but they were more like isolated, fires before. Although we have been reporting, Marlene, in your program about the agricultural fields. So, but those were really much more along that area. So we already knew that there were going to be fires, but this time it looks that it just basically became a widespread, jumping into several areas across the landscape.
Does this now force a shift in your mandate to be able to learn and build your capacity in dealing with fires, since this is now a new phenomenon that you have to deal with?
Yes, certainly, Imani. I mean, the idea on all environmental groups is once there's a threat, an environmental threat in this case, of course, we look at new interventions that we have to put in. For FCD, we believe that there are two main things, and as we were basically looking at our information of many years, we realized that in 2009 there was a policy and strategy and a strategy developed in terms of dealing with wildland fires. That was presented to the Forest Department. That's over 10 years ago. The plan outlined very clearly that public outreach and public education is critically important. The involvement of communities, that was really one of the key elements. And so there are two things to look at this. One is being able to prevent it, either through community participation processes, the communities to be informed on what to do in order really to prevent any of these fires from occurring. And then, of course, really to combat it, once those become a wildfire. in the case of us, additionally, what really becomes critical because of the binational element with Guatemala.
Yeah, of course.
So in that respect, it is something also that needs to be, added in as new interventions. Now, those interventions, even though we have been doing, partnerships with Guatemalans, even though they have been fighting fires on their own, also even much more bigger fires. In fact, they just got a helicopter from Honduras to be able to put out their fires in the Maya Biosphere Reserve until yesterday. And so they have the capabilities and some of the skill and the skills of being able to fight these big fires. But for us, we don't really have those abilities. I mean, to fight a jungle, fire is completely different from fighting one right nearby to a village. It's
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
because of the remoteness and all of that access, water sources, all of this. So we need really to look at it from, I would say, a much more generic and comprehensive plan. And part of that, and one of my recommendations is the development of a task force. The Forestry Department has started one, some time ago, but particularly looking at the northern part. If you recall, the Mennonites had some issues with Guatemalans a couple of years ago.
Yeah.
And so that's when a sort of a platform was developed, but for looking into the southern part of the Maya Mountains, in looking at those fires along the western border, that we need really to address it much more comprehensively with Guatemalans, because the source of the problem in terms of fires along that area is really more a transboundary one. It's coming from Guatemala.
Yeah.
So
and in fact, they have more people living in the area there than clearly in the Chiquibul. We don't have villages or anything where people are farming, at least legally, because we know the Guatemalans come over. But Raf, let me interject there. So you spoke clearly of Guatemala getting resources from Honduras to help them to fight their fires. One of the things with forest fires is that it's exactly what you say. You can't have a team of men going in with hoses. That's not how you address a forest fire. Yeah. Have you had conversations with the forestry here about possibly using some of our government equipment, the helicopters, for example, or other aviation machines that can be used to maybe help in dousing the fire or to do something to prevent the spread?
Well, as how I mentioned, the Forest Department now has some heavy machinery in the Vaca, for example, and at this time. So that is basically to build a fire line
okay.
in order to contain those fires. Now, helicopters are, it's not really any type of helicopter that can be able to do the dousing of water of forest. It's basically a special helicopter, and that's why not even Guatemalans would have this. Last year Guatemala got it from Mexico, and this year they got it from Honduras. So it's really a sort of a special equipment that is used.
Yeah.
But I think as we start really to advance and see more of the drought, because the drought also has to do is basically creating that environment now for more forest fires to occur, and so is project into the future, we do see that dry years, and less humidity is basically appearing, right there as from last year, and this year, and also next year. Yeah. So we really need to start to look at the configuration of other interventions. Either we will need really to get more partners together, either be able to prevent it more across the borders, but it has to be a more comprehensive plan. And I think this is going to be now the time, particularly Marlene and Isani, when now the people are really more concerned about their health issues, because it's no longer only a matter of biodiversity as how we have been talking about over the years. Now people are really getting now connected to this matter because of their health. Here in Cayo, all around the country, you are hearing more of people getting worried, concerned. People are unable to sleep. So health is now really coming more as a key thematic of interest in terms of aligning that to forest fires.
I couldn't imagine. We had one mildly smoky day here from the winds coming in from Honduras, and it was uncomfortable, to say the least. But Raf, this is why I think getting a handle on the situation is important. It's hard to think of anything beyond beyond the pandemic that we're currently facing, but it was just a few months ago that we saw the biggest wildfire in history in Australia that just completely polluted air far beyond that continent itself. So it's not impossible, and they were facing the same thing, unprecedented dry seasons that they'd not seen before. And they are far better resourced. So I'm saying with knowing the history of the Amazon fire, the Australian fire, should we perhaps act as cautiously as possible with the fires that we're seeing in the Chiquibul?
Yeah, of course, and I think we should not really have been in a position of basically reacting. I think that's why the plans were there quite some years ago, in terms of really being much more proactive in this level. I can say, Marlene, that in fact just about 2 weeks ago, we took out a study because we are funded by PACT, and thanks to PACT for their assistance. And one of the markers and output that we needed to demonstrate is if the efforts on the ground is basically paying off. The study that we just concluded about 2 weeks ago, it demonstrated that reclaiming the land in the Chiquibul was about 10.5% in terms of the forest returning back. I can tell you that when you fly over these areas now, goodness, all of that 10% and is basically gone.
Wow.
So if you go over the Vaca, like what we did on Wednesday of last week, if you fly over, it's impossible to imagine how this thing really occurred and what we now have to do. It was really dramatic.
Yeah.
It's just.
I keep on hearing you say that, Raf. Can you maybe just help us quantify? You say you've seen fires before. If you want to use percentages or even number of fires, what's the difference between what you're accustomed to seeing versus what you're seeing now? Help us understand.
Yeah, I think in the Chiquibul and the Caracol, there were. There have been like fires before because of the agricultural fields, but alone in the Vaca in the Vaca area, just over a week ago, there were 28 hotspots, and 28 hotspots means basically large areas. These are not really looking at the small little fumes coming out. If we start to look at the fumes coming out, it would just become increasingly much more higher, over 200 or so. If we look in the Caracol had 7 of the key hotspot areas, and in the Chiquibul there were 15 hotspot areas. Now these hotspot areas are quite large areas. In other words, like tomorrow we are going to Chiquibul only to assess back again, and we are carrying a couple of technicians to give us a better idea and an assessment. But in the Chiquibul, for the first time, we see those fires jumping over the main road, Cebada, and big trees are dropping. I did send a video up to your channel there where you can see how these broadleaf trees are basically dropping. So it means that the intensity of those fires and the extension that is really covering, it's highly dramatic.
So I hear you saying it's an increase in numbers, it's an increase in intensity, and it's also in areas that you don't normally see it. All of these.
Yes, exactly.
What percentage would you say in terms of the numbers of fires are you seeing this year versus years in the past? What's the increase?
I would say that it's like in the Chiquibul, we are seeing much more than 10 times more than what originally it has been. The Vaca is the most hit right now. Vaca is amazingly, I don't know. I mean, it's I don't know if it's 20 times more than what originally we have seen before. The problem on this also, Marlene, is that what we are observing, you see the fires on areas like on pasture lands, but then you see other fumes coming out from afar into other areas. In other words, like in the Chiquibul, if we see a fire right along the 1 kilometer, but then you see other fumes appearing, behind those mountains. In other words, you are seeing, fumes up to 2 to 3 kilometers, within national territory. Yeah. So those fumes, if it doesn't rain, then certainly those ones are going to continue on, just progressively, just becoming bigger fires. I mean, the remoteness in these areas and southern Chiquibul, I mean, even though it's the biggest water reserve in this country,
Yes.
because the headwaters are there, but a lot of the water is basically underground.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you go there and you try really to get water to access it, it's not really that easy really to be able to just be able to pump water or to be able to get water.
Yeah.
So and so it's a combination of things. I would say that and so our main bet, our best bet, is basically to prevent it. And to
Yeah.
prevent it means that Guatemala also has to be aboard at this. And that's where I basically mentioned that in my recommendations, it would be critically important for Belize as a country to be able to make an exchange of note, to the government in Guatemala, um, because it is not basically, what we're observing is not really the same typical things of over the years. This thing is really much more a disparity of those number of fires occurring, and that includes also the Caracol, and it includes the Vaca. For the first time also, we saw an increase of fires in the Columbia River Forest Reserve, which is south. I think the Maya Leaders Alliance have been able to make a shout also at it that there's more incursions into their area. The Columbia River, we saw a big fire that was there from the area of El Carrizal from Guatemala. And so we are seeing all along that western border a whole disparity of forest fires.
This is areas managed by Yakshare Conservation Trust, correct?
In the area of Columbia River, no, there's no co-manager. This is
Okay.
basically the forest department.
Okay.
I know the Maya Leaders Alliance have been, trying to get also assistance from the community leaders in terms of seeing what really to do with that forest. But that's technically only the forest department as far as I know.
Okay.
Now, looking at, and I appreciate you acknowledging first the human impact that can happen, which is just the health repercussions of wildfires with the air pollution. But there's also impact to biodiversity. I mean, you have lots of wildlife that lives in that area. You also know, I mean, you're talking about broadleaf trees, but these are trees that take many, many, many years to grow into full maturity and to provide the right shelter for these biodiversity. Talk to us about that type of impact and how that concerns you for the conservation efforts.
Yeah, there are three main components that are highly impacted from the conditions of the fires today. And biodiversity is one of those. The climate change is the other one, and then, of course, the health issues. But in terms of biodiversity, we have not been able to quantify, and I don't think anyone has been able to quantify, at least here in Belize, in terms of the effects that a fire has on wild animals and creatures out there in the jungles. Once a tree drops, then it carries many other trees. There are perimeters of a coverage that is basically impacted as a result of that. There's a whole open, areas and gaps that are open in the forest whenever a fire is passing through. What happens when those trees drop and they collapse is basically now you see a secondary forest coming up. So that's where we call it wamiles that are created under the forest. So that changes the whole sort of the ecosystem there. The animals that are living there are displaced. They have to find somewhere else to go. Many of them, the small ones that are unable to fly, like the snakes that are only able to crawl, all of these basically animals, they just are smoked and they die right there in these forest fires. There's anecdotal information of people under the forest that you would see, like deer, dead deer, other animals that are unable then really to escape the wildfires. So there's a lot of impact. The nests of birds, you can hear the animals crying, for example, the howler monkeys. So these animals, once they're encircled by a fire, of course, they are just going to collapse and they're going to die. So a lot of the impacts, we cannot, it's very hard really for us to quantify. What's the life of an animal? How do you put a price? This kind of things. So it's really.
But we do know. I think what you're saying though is that it is happening and it does have the potential to happen. And while we don't necessarily put a monetary value on our they do hold great importance to us as Belizeans. you talk about our howler monkey crying, and I feel that one
Yeah,
instantaneously,
yeah.
or the beautiful scarlet macaws
eggs
that,
in the
that
nest.
you care for and monitor in the Chiquibul. Those all of these other animals are important to us, whether or not we can put a price tag on them. So, Rafael, I will always appreciate the fact that you ensure that even though Chiquibul is far removed from our everyday reality, you keep us aware of what's happening. What are the critical next steps that have to be taken for us to address this situation? One, you said you're really hoping Belize will send a formal note to Guatemala to have them do their part on their side of the border with the forest fires. What else?
Yeah, the other interventions that we are recommending is we do need to create that task force of technical people ready to come up with an action plan. We ourselves will have really to get more of the capabilities and the training and the equipment to have it there and be able to use it whenever this kind of spates of fire occur. We need really to promulgate and to increase a full community outreach program and campaign. Messages through the radio, messages through the TV stations. All of this will be critically important. We also need really to apply the law, application of the rule. We have basically sent, patrols out there into the Chiquibul. The directive is we will detain anyone that is captured out there, and hopefully then they would be prosecuted in court. And that's not only in the case of Guatemalans, that is not only for Guatemalan, because the law applies to anyone. We have been discussing with the forest department that wherever we have known that there are people who have put fires, for example, in Vaca, then they need to be prosecuted. The only way that people are going to understand these things, that they will be able to be much more respectful of the law, is basically to apply it. And so we feel that it has to be done. If not, people take it for granted that the fires, you can just come in and lit it and it's gone and then you just go home. That's not the way how these things operate.
Yeah.
Many people are suffering by reversing climate change. Climate, how much pumping of gas emissions are going there every day. In Guatemala, they already have come up with an estimate in the Vaca Forest Reserve. So here we are seeing a lot of those fumes going up. So I feel that the impact, and in terms of the economy, that's the other thing.
Yeah.
If we start to quantify what really are the losses, then I think a person has to be much more sensitized and much more aware that the impact that they are doing only by one lit of a fire by one individual, it really is creating a havoc and now obviously people are able to feel it, people are able to sense it, people are able to really recognize that it is really a critical matter. And so the application of law is also important.
Yeah.
So I think that those recommendations are at best at this point in time. We can only do so much, and we have always said that, Marlene, as an NGO, we can recommend, we can be able to do certain things, but the state also have to take that level of responsibility.
Yeah.
And be able also to do the application of the rule, and of course be able to bring in other counterparts. FCD is here basically to assist. The coverage that we are doing, through the aerial reconnaissance, demonstrated that it is not only isolated to the Chiquibul. This area now has increased in terms of the effects. Columbia River, the Caracol is getting a big hit out of forest fires, today. And Vaca, of course, also likewise.
So, there was a statutory instrument passed last week increasing the regulations for intentionally setting fires. And so enforcement is going to be a crucial part of this. But for people who just may be unaware of what they're doing, what type of behaviors, if you are in these areas, do you just want to stay away from?
Well, for right now, in the Vaca, many of these particular areas are closed off right now from any level of visitation.
Yeah.
So basically, no one is allowed to go into the Chiquibul, into the mountain pine ridge, unless you are working there, but not really for recreational opportunities.
Yeah.
The Vaca farmers are still going there. The Vaca Plateau, there's farmers from Arenal, Benqueviejo, Socots. Um, but the point here is that the fires that were created were done a couple of days ago. If anyone is hoping really to put any more burns in terms of for their farmings, they need to ensure that they get a proper permit, which for now is not granted.
Yeah.
Forestry Department nor the Ministry of Agriculture providing any permits for burning right now.
Yeah.
So they need really to uphold the regulations and the law. They need to obey the rules. If anyone is caught, I think that they need to understand that they can end up paying their $5,000 and or their 2 months of imprisonment. And I certainly hope that really, someone can be caught, because that's how people are going to really see that this thing is really truly into effect. That's quite a remark that we probably shouldn't say, but the only way that we have seen, Marlene, is that people learn only by really
when there's enforcement.
Oh,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah. Well, we do appreciate you sounding the alarm for us once again, and we hope that we see some progress in terms of people not going out and creating any fire, and that a resolution is made in terms of what's happening on the Guatemalan side, clearly already impacting Belize. Thank you very much for joining us this morning, Rafael.
Yes, certainly. Yeah, thanks so much. You guys have a nice day. Thank you.
Best of luck and stay safe.
Yes, certainly. Thank you the same. Take care. Bye.
All right. There you have it, the situation of forest fires in the Chiquibul. Clearly, it's a critical situation, and we do appreciate Friends for Conservation and Development keeping us updated as to what is happening there. We're going to go ahead and take a break, and when we come back, well, this is going to be a fun one, I guess. If you're at home and you have not been able to see a barber in the past few weeks, well, we can only imagine what you look like. But we're going to help you. We have someone who's going to guide us through an at-home haircut for men. That's coming up after the break.